for joining us for this week's lesson of God's Got This, a Bible study in the book of Esther. And now, here's Pastor Josh.
Amen. All right, Esther chapter 7. If you have your Bibles, go there, and we are going to be going through two chapters basically tonight, chapter 7 and 8, so I hope that you can follow along. Take some notes there in the handout that you have as well. If you were not here on this past Sunday, let me encourage you to come by the table over here and to pick up one of these cards that has our new schedule on it that will begin in March, where we will be having two morning worship services, one at 9:30, one at 11, and our evening schedule also will change a little bit, so encourage you to pick one of these up and plan to jump in and join this. I know I've gotten such encouraging feedback from many people, and I appreciate that. I know that there are 121 different ways that we could do this, and we have talked through so many of them. We want to try this one. We would like to have all the faith groups on Sunday evening if we can, and just have a great time of community and family time on Sunday evenings. We'll be back here. We've tried to make it at 5 o'clock so that families can get home. Families who have children you can be home with your children on Sunday night by 6:30 or so and have plenty of time to get them in bed at an early time, and also where those that don't like to drive at night in the dark don't have to do that as much. So we hope and pray that this will work, and as I said Sunday, that I hope you will take a step in this journey, whatever, and it's good to see new faces here tonight and a great crowd here tonight. Thank you for being here tonight. And Wednesday nights will continue much like they are now, except for the addition to the meal. So I'm excited about this. Be inviting people to come, be a part of it. You know, empty seats. There will be more empty seats in both of those services for a while. And I remember when we first came here, when there were 70 or so on a Sunday morning, and there was a lot of empty seats, and the Lord began to fill those seats. And sometimes when almost every seat is full, not only is it uncomfortable for people who are visiting to come in and try and find a seat, but we get comfortable with them being full. So I hope that you will take it as a challenge to fill those empty seats and invite people to come with you. Just curious, how many of you plan to come to the 9:30 service? Raise your hand. Oh my goodness. All right, so we have most of this crowd we know will be here at 9:30. Maybe it's the 11 o'clock one that we will not have as many. Oh, I have to finish on time at 9:30. Gotcha. All right. Very nice. Very nice. Maybe we'll have to offer some incentives for the 11 o'clock service. Well, now that I'm on the clock, let's get started. What, Sue? Well, you can stay for both if you would like to, but I don't think very many will do that. You don't want to have to hear me twice. You can stay and hear the choir twice and then leave. Yes, only the children. There's only one children's church service, and that's at 11. So if you come to the 9:30 service, your children can stay in the service here with you. But if you bring them at 11, we figured that most parents who are trying to get children ready will come to the 11 o'clock service, and so that's why we chose that time for that service. All right, I better not start taking questions or we might not get into the study tonight. So let's jump right in. Over the last several weeks, we have been greatly encouraged as we have been looking at chapters 4 through 6 at both the providence of God and the favor of God. And now tonight we're going to come to chapter 7 and 8. And again, we are going to be encouraged to see the deliverance of God. And this is an intense passage that we come to tonight. In fact, as you read it, you begin to get nervous for Haman as you begin to read it. The scene is the second banquet. If you remember the last time we were together, Esther has invited King Ahasuerus and Haman to two dinners, two banquets. The first one for whatever reason, we don't know, she did not ask the king her request. And so she invited them to a second banquet. And so as we come to the text tonight, we are in the scene of the second banquet. And we're reminded in this how quickly things can change in our life. We see Haman go from the heights of human glory to the depths of public execution in just a moment of time. And history is full of powerful people, isn't it, who in just a moment of time, their destiny was changed. You think of Napoleon, who on the night of his departure on his Russian campaign stated to so many people how they had the war won, how he was going to conquer them. And he was so arrogantly promoting his plans that a woman overhearing him said, "Sir, man proposes, but God disposes." And hearing the warning, Napoleon said, "No, madam, I propose and dispose as well." A few months later, he had lost over 80% of his army, and he had to retreat in disgrace. You think of Judas Iscariot in the Bible, who was trusted by the other disciples, who had a position with the 12. He was the money keeper. And in one night, he went from this position amongst the 12 disciples, this position of honor, to committing suicide in one night and hanging himself. In chapter 6, here in our text, we saw Haman humiliated by being forced to parade Mordecai, the one man that he hated. He was forced to honor him in front of the entire province. And after the pomp of the day, Haman returned to his home to grieve. A different story than when he went home to his friends and family to brag that he was going to be the only guest at the dinner with the king and queen. And when he told his wife and his advisors what had happened, you remember that they warned him to be careful because Mordecai, being a Jew, would prevail. It's amazing how they had looked at history and had seen the Jewish people and God's protection of them. In fact, look back at chapter 6, verse 12 through 14 real quick. "And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. But Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared." So in this discussion that he is having with his wife and his counselors, the king's chamberlain came to escort him to the second dinner that the queen had prepared for them. And now the story of Esther begins to turn. Oh, what a day may bring forth, and how quickly things can change. Up to this point, things had looked great for Haman. He was prospering. King Ahasuerus was granting whatever he requested. In fact, up to this point, things had looked very bleak for the Jews, for Esther, for Mordecai. But now the story begins to turn as God's plan to preserve his people begins to unfold. So we enter the banquet room, and first of all, we see in our text the request of Esther. Remember that at this point, neither King Ahasuerus or Haman knew that Esther was a Jew. She had kept this secret from them, and Haman is probably still reeling because of the events of the day, but he composed himself. He hoped to enjoy the banquet. Had Haman known that Esther was a Jew, he would have either ran for his life or he would have fallen before the king and begged the king for mercy. And Esther had one purpose in this exclusive banquet, and that was to make her petition, to make her request before the king. We see here not only the request of Esther, but we see the king's prompting of her. Pleased by Esther's respect and Esther's honor, the king was ready to listen to her. And so in verse number 2, look at it, of chapter 7, the king said again unto Esther, on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. You read this and you think, who is this guy? Remember the King Ahasuerus of chapter 1? He is a totally different guy now than he was in chapter 1. And it's almost like the heart of the king was in the hand of the Lord. It's almost as if God is turning the heart of the king, and he is doing so. So for the third time now, Esther has not given him an answer of what she is wanting. It's like when I ask Kim where she wants to go to dinner, and you just can't get an answer out of her. It's undecided. Esther seems undecided. She's not undecided. She knows what she wants, and she's waiting for the right time. Maybe that's what Kim's doing in the dinner. She's waiting for the right time. But she's waiting for the perfect time to make her requests known. This is the moment. This is what it has come down to. You remember what Mordecai had told Esther? Perhaps God has brought you to the kingdom for such a time as this. Well, look, this is the time. This is the moment. This is when faith must be stronger than fear in Esther's heart. And so we see in verse number 3, Esther's petition to the king. Then Esther the queen answered, verse number 3, and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, and she had. We already read that in the last chapter. If it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. Again, as we saw last time, Esther approaches the king with respect and with submission. There's no arrogance in her demeanor. There's no arrogance in her demands. Notice the phrases there. If I have found favor in thy sight, O king. If it please the king. Both of these statements give deference to the king. Esther is filled with this inner peace and this humility in her request that arises out of a confidence. She's not confident in herself and her position, but she is confident in the character and the control of God and his promises to her people. And like Esther, we do not have to let the difficult situations of life disrupt our inner peace. We talked about this last time. There ought to be a calm confidence in the heart and life of the children of God, not because we're confident in ourselves and our ability, but because we are confident in the character of who our God is and the sovereignty of our God, the control of our God. We trust him in every situation as he leads us and guides us. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, most of us could quote it, and it's one of those verses that becomes so familiar sometimes that we really forget the impact of it. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and do not lean into your own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him. This is a tremendous promise. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and what? He shall direct thy paths. He'll direct our steps if we will simply trust in him. We do not need to be filled with fear. We can have this peace, this inner calmness. Isaiah 26 verse 3, thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee because he trusteth in thee. Did you get that? Whose mind is stayed on thee, on God. When our minds are directed to God, when our minds are focused on God, on his character, on his power, then we have this inner peace that is given to us by God. In verse 3, Esther revealed that she was not Persian. It was a moment of great vulnerability, and the king could have easily responded in anger. He had been tricked, perhaps. But God granted Esther strength and courage in her human weakness. That's what God does for us in those moments. In our moments of greatest human weakness, God gives us strength and God gives us courage. It's what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 through 9, when he said, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Has there ever been anything in your life that you thought, if this was just out of my life, if this was just removed out of my life, I could serve God much better? If I didn't have to worry about this thing? I have to be honest that for the first several years when our boys were diagnosed with a liver disease, that was my attitude, that was my mindset. This is holding us back. This is keeping us from doing what we could do, until I eventually realized that was part of God's plan to make us lean into him, to experience his strength, to give us opportunities we never would have had otherwise for the glory of God. It is in these moments of weakness that God shows up and gives us the strength and the courage to do what he's called us to do. And then we see not only the king's prompting in Esther's petition, but in verse number 4, we see the Jewish plight. With the words, for we are sold, Esther is reminding the king that he had been paid to issue the decree to annihilate the Jews. Look at the first part of verse number 4. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. And the wording there is so important, because this is the same wording, the exact wording that is given in the decree from Haman in Esther chapter 3 and verse 9, where Haman said, if it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. This seemed like a good business deal to the king. It was going to bring money into his kingdom. He was not in great standing with the people. He had just lost a difficult war. Esther is pointing out that the king would be receiving blood money if this decree would be carried out on her people, the Jews. And she continues emphasizing the weighty nature of this life and death situation. Look at the second part of verse number 4. She said, but if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Esther points out that for the king to mistreat the Jews, he would bring his own downfall. He would jeopardize his own people and kingdom by going against the kingdom or the people of God. And history tells that story, doesn't it? Time and time again, wicked dictators and nations who try to go against God's people, they are brought to nothing. Besides her courage, what is again remarkable about Esther's plea is her diplomacy, her sensitivity. As Esther pleads for the life of her people, she essentially says that if we were only being sold into slavery, I wouldn't bother you with this request. By the way, they had already gone through that before, hadn't they? If we were only being sold into slavery, I wouldn't bring this to you, but we have been sentenced to death. And Esther's words had a tremendous impact on the king. He was outraged that someone would want to hurt his queen and wanted to know who would do such a thing. And again, we see Esther's wisdom in presenting this. We see, secondly, the revelation of Haman. And here is where Esther reveals the man behind it all. Haman is identified. How many chess players do we have? Not very many. Brother Chris is. I know he teaches a chess club here at our school. I am quite confident that if anybody in this room has played chess before, you could probably beat me in chess. It's not my sport, quote unquote. I remember in high school that we were given an elective option to either join the chess club, small school, or to join a home economics class. I was an athlete, played all the sports in the small school, basketball, baseball, and soccer. And so It wasn't a great option. Kim probably wished that I would have chosen the home economics class, but I didn't. I chose chess. And still today, I don't know if I could even play a chess match with someone. I'd have to be refreshed. But I remember when I was studying this, I remembered one thing that our chess instructor used to always tell us, and that was always keep your eye on the queen. Always keep your eye on the queen. The queen was to be protected and guarded more than any other piece that you had, besides, of course, the king. The queen was your most powerful offensive weapon, and the queen of your opponent was to be your most feared enemy. Could change things quickly. Never ignore the movement of your opponent's queen, and always know where your queen is on the board. If you wanted to summarize the downfall of Haman, you could summarize it in one sentence, and that is that he failed to keep his eye on the queen. It looked like he was moving all the right parts. He was focused on all the other things, but he was not focused on the queen. He had no idea that Queen Esther was about to become his most dreaded opponent. He had failed to do his homework. He had been moving all the pieces, assuming the queen was a non-issue. And boy, was he wrong. Because in her heart and in her mind, by the wisdom of God, it was Esther that would bring about the wicked imaginations, the wicked heart of Haman. In wisdom, Esther knew that she needed to separate the act, what had happened, from the doer of the act, for the king to get the understanding, the full understanding, the weight of this wicked imagination behind the decree. And the king wasn't quite catching all that she's saying at first, although I can imagine as she begins to lay this out for the king, and it's the king and Haman and Esther. And now as Esther begins to unravel this, I can imagine that Haman is starting to slide down in his seat. His heart is beating a little bit faster as he realizes that Esther is a Jew, that he had brought this decree to the king for the Jews to be killed. Look at verse 5 and 6. This is where your palms start to get sweaty for Haman. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? And where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so, to do this? Now he's really getting nervous, isn't he? And Esther said, the adversary, an enemy, is this wicked Haman. Don't you want to know how she said that? She's in lawyer mode now, isn't she? She turns and says, this is the man, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and queen. Imagine what's going on in the king's mind. First, he finds out that his wife, the queen, and her people are now sentenced to be killed. He found out that she was a Jew. But by this time, Esther has his heart, and he is ready to punish whoever is behind this. And then Esther reveals that his own prime minister was behind the evil deed. And she used her words very carefully. The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman, and she continues to raise the tension and the suspense with every word, guided by God. God's timing, again, it's always perfect, isn't it? We saw that last week in the timing of all this. If Esther would have told the king at the first banquet her request, it would have been before he was reminded that it was Mordecai, a Jew, who 5 years earlier had saved his life. You remember that story last week. The king could not sleep, and so he has them come in and read to him the chronicles, the happenings of the kingdom. And the guy who begins to read for him begins to read the story from 5 years previous, where Mordecai had found out the plot that there were two men who were going to kill the king, and he told Esther about it, and his life was saved. And the king starts to wonder, what did we do for this guy? He starts to realize these people are loyal people. These people are good people. These people are not our enemies. And God was working all of these things for his glory in his own time. Did you know this? God is the ultimate strategist. You look at the board called life, and look, God is in control of the board. He's moving things. He's moving people. Even when he is silent, he is present. Even when he seems removed, he remains sovereign. Even when he seems late. Have you ever thought God was late? Are you ever going to show up? If you would have already showed up, our brother would be alive now. Remember that New Testament story? You're late, Jesus. You're late, God. But we will one day look on the other side of history, and we will look back and we will realize he was never once early. He was never once late. He is always on time. Always. His purposes are fulfilled at just the right time. We see not only was Haman identified, but he is indicted after seeing firsthand the courage of Mordecai and the graciousness of Esther. These characteristics coming from the Jewish people. The king was infuriated that anyone would want to hurt this group of people who have been so kind and respectful to him. Enraged, the king had to step out of the banquet to collect himself. And look what happens in verse number 7. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. The blinders are now off of King Ahasuerus. He sees the full picture. He had been bluffed by Haman. Meanwhile, Haman, now left in the room alone, just he and Esther, began to beg her for his life. Look at chapter 7, verse 7, the second part. And Haman stood up to make requests for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereof Esther was. So if he wasn't already angry before, he's extremely angry now. The full wrath of the king is now aimed at his once favored assistant. And we see that he is punished, verses 9 and 10. Seeing the wrath of the king, which is very obvious, one of the chamberlains informed him that the gallows were already available for Haman's execution. The very ones that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. Look at verse 9. And Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Look, God in his sovereignty and in his time made the wrongs right. God always makes the wrongs right in his own time. We can trust him, can't we, to do the same for us? We can trust him to do the same for us. We don't have to live our lives worried if other people are going to get away with treating us and others that way. We don't have to live our lives being filled with bitterness and anger and drinking the cup of bitterness while hoping that others will be affected by it. We are hurt. We are the ones hurt by drinking the cup of bitterness. We are the ones who are damaged. Rather than just saying, God's got this. God's in control. I don't have to step in. I don't have to try to bring vengeance. God's in control of this. Paul writes of this in Romans chapter 12, verse 17. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Listen, may this never be the testimony that we as Christians are trying to pay back evil upon people who have brought evil to others. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, not says Josh. It's not my job, says the Lord. Don't ever forget this truth. In all that God allows into our life, God is working to conform us into the image of his Son, Jesus. In all that he allows to come into our lives, even those who may seem set on destroying you and destroying your reputation and hurting you, don't become angry and bitter, filled with wrath, trying to become vengeful at them. Realize that God is working everything or allowing everything in our lives to conform us to the image of his Son, Jesus. If he only wants to make us comfortable, he wouldn't allow the roadblocks. He wouldn't allow the reversals, the trials. But God's goal in making all things work together for good. We all know that verse, don't we? Romans 8:28. For all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. But sometimes we forget the verse after that. The verse after that gives us the goal. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate. Notice this phrase, to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Not to make us comfortable, but to make us conformable to the image of his Son. And that's why he isn't as interested many times in delivering us from the challenges of life as he is developing us through the challenges of life, because he is at work in our life. As we used to sing as little children, he's still working on me to make me what I ought to be. We're a work in progress. And the ultimate goal is to squeeze us, to conform us into the image of his Son, Jesus. We see the request of Esther. We see the revelation of Haman. We see the relief for the Jews. Thirdly, even after sentencing Haman, King Ahasuerus still has a problem. You remember that these decrees could not be reversed, not even by the king himself, whose stamp was on the decree. Couldn't be revoked, so it had to be countered. We see Mordecai's destiny here in chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. After revealing her race, Esther also told the king of her relationship with Mordecai, that Mordecai had basically taken her in as a cousin and raised her. And by this time, the king had realized who his real friends were, who the people who had his best interest in mind really were. And so they had gained his respect because of their loyalty and wisdom. Look at chapter 8. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. This just keeps getting better and better, doesn't it? Just a day earlier, you remember what was happening in this very house? Haman was plotting and planning and bragging about the upcoming death of Mordecai. And now, Haman is hung on the gallows that he made for Mordecai, and Mordecai's living in his house and sleeping in his bed. It's his. A lot can change in one day, can't it? And it would do us well in our own lives to Remember, in the valleys of life, in the moments where we feel mistreated or persecuted, would do us well to remember the sovereign control of God, and that we're not living for this world, are we? We're pilgrims, we're aliens, we're travelers in this world, headed to a new heaven, headed to a new earth, where God will right all of the wrongs that have been made. It's good to remind ourselves that every difficulty, no matter how long it is, every difficulty we face in this life is temporary. Paul wrote, reminding us of the contrast in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He says, verse 17, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." He says in Romans chapter 8 and verse 18, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time," he's using a banking term there, a financial term. "I reckon that the sufferings," when I compare them, when I look at them in contrast, "that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." You know what he's saying? When you're going through a difficult time, when you're in the middle of something, when people are against you, but you're standing with the Lord, you know how you get through those times? Remember how shallow this is compared to the glory of eternity. Keep an eternal mindset, an eternal perspective. So here in the text, Haman's old job and house, it's now Mordecai's, ring and all. And we are again reminded that promotion and demotion comes ultimately from who? From God. Promotion and demotion ultimately come from God. None of this could have been possible without the working of a sovereign God. Psalm 75, 6 and 7. "For promotion comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is the judge, and he putteth down one and setteth up another." Again, we have responsibilities. We have a responsibility to speak for truth. We have a responsibility to vote for truth and vote for God's word. But again, in 2024, in an election year, let me remind you who ultimately will set up, and put down. God is in control. God is in control. John Butler said, "God will provide promotions if they are necessary to do his work, to fulfill his plan." Look here just a moment. If you think for 1 second that whoever is voted in to the White House of the United States is going to thwart God's plan, you have a wrong perspective of eternity and the power of God. Again, we want the right person in there. We want a person with biblical values in there, don't we? Certainly we do. And we ought to vote that way, and we ought to speak up for those things. But we need to get this in our minds. God will provide promotions if they're necessary to do his work. He says you do not need to pull strings, know the right people, bribe the powers that be, or manipulate people to obtain high positions. If you need promotion to do God's work, God will see to it that you get it. And you will obtain it in an honorable way. I love that. Mordecai could have never worked up all of this. Divine destiny that God had put together. But what about the rest of the Jews? We see their deliverance in verses 3 and following. Esther came to the king one more time to plead for her people, for the king to save her people from the wicked decree that had been thought up by Haman. And she implores the king's favor once again. Look at verse number 3. And Esther spake yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Verse 6, for how can I endure to see the evil that shall come into my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? She is showing the king her heart, her emotions, her feelings. And notice how he handles the irrevocable decree. The king gives freedom to the Jews. Look at verse 7. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews. In other words, I can't revoke the other decree, but let's make this new decree. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name, my name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. Again, we see the king's trust in Mordecai as he gives Mordecai, basically, you write the law, Mordecai, that will give the Jews an opportunity to live. Look at verse 9. He allows the Jews to defend themselves. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, to the lieutenants, to the deputies and rulers of the provinces which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and he sealed it with the king's ring, and he sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life. In other words, he gives them the right to defend themselves with the king's allegiance backing it. To stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the post that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan, the palace. The Jews now had the right to protect themselves, and they had the allegiance of the king. And then thirdly, we see their delight, the Jews' jubilation and delight. Mordecai was honored with great respect, and joy and rejoicing exploded among the Jews as they heard the news of this decree announced. Look at verse 15. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. Look at the change of the culture in this empire. The people now are honoring the Jews. They're loving the Jews. They're welcomed there. Whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. From the beginning of Esther chapter 7 to the end of Esther chapter 8, everything has changed for the Jewish people. From being condemned to being protected. As the Jews celebrated the victory from their God, it was a testimony, by the way. It was a testimony to the power of their God. And many Persians were converted to the Jewish faith. Look at verse 17, the second part. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. They now wanted the same God that had showed such power and sovereignty. What were they drawn to? Were they drawn to Mordecai? Were they drawn to Esther? I would say they were drawn to the character of their God. In essence, they were saying this: look, we want what they have. We want what they have. We want a God like their God. We want a God who has that much power, who has that much sovereignty. And listen, church, as we close, sometimes when we are called to walk through times of trial and difficulty publicly, sometimes we may be mocked and we may be ridiculed for our faith, but remember that God never moves in our life without a purpose or a plan. Remember that the main reason that we are here is to glorify God and to point people to our God, to point people to a relationship with Jesus Christ, to point people to a supernatural strength that we could never have in our own human power and our own human strength. Ultimately, it is to point them to Jesus Christ, for them to watch the difficulty, for them to watch how we handle criticism, for them to watch how we handle certain situations that we go through, and not for them to be attracted to us, but for them to be attracted to our God. The Lord, how many of you know this? You've seen it. The Lord can use our testimony in the middle of a great trial or even a character assassination to bring others to faith in Christ as they watch on. What would happen in our country if Christians, as we talked about last week, would fast and pray for revival? What would happen if we really claimed 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. I want to remind us all tonight that people are watching us. We have a responsibility. How do we respond in the difficulties of life? What is our demeanor? Is there that joy? Is there that calmness? Is there that peace? Is there that love? That rest that we experience when we simply trust in God no matter what is happening around us, no matter what is happening to us. We rest and we trust in a sovereign God, because even when we may think it's out of our control, this is out of our control. This is over our head. We can always remember that God's in control. God has it. And may they see that in our life, that we truly trust that. It's easy to say God's got it. It's something else to live like God's got it and to respond like God's got it. And we don't have enough human strength to do that, which means that in our weakness, insufficiencies, things that we cannot work up, may God be seen strong in us to do supernatural things, to respond. Look, I'm done. To respond, and I still have 3 minutes. To respond in supernatural ways. To respond in supernatural ways to things that happen to us, to things that are said about us. Are we able to respond in supernatural ways?
We trust that this lesson has been both challenging and encouraging to your walk with Christ. Please join us again next week as we continue with God's Got This.